Hello, and welcome to the notes for rigid transformations. Let's go through these pretty quickly. Hopefully it won't take too long. So we're going to do a little differently this time. Instead of going through my notes as I read through this, we're going to look through Mrs. Haberlack notes as exploring what her way of taking notes is and how it differs a little bit from mine, but is pretty similar as well. That way we have different note-taking styles for you to adopt for whichever one feels best for you. Okay. So what we're going to start with in the notes, I'm on the page on Agile Mind that we're going to start with. You'll notice this is a little bit into the pages, right? Let's revisit the notes to see exactly why we're starting a little bit further into it. So here you can see at the very top, our essential questions about rigid transformations are, what are they and how can they help us solve problems? And our language target is to understand the language of transformations. So remember, I recommend taking the notes, maybe not during the lessons, but right afterwards, right? So you can really reflect on the concept of the lesson. Look at that. Reflection is on this page too. But notice when in class we started with reflection, rotations, and translations, right? Now we're actually doing it the other way around. We're going to start with rigid transformations, which was the ultimate goal. So it makes sense to have that as the first thing in our notes to really emphasize that that's the thing we're answering. Because the language target of understanding the language of transformations, right? That comes afterwards. That's building on rigid transformations. So it makes sense to start with the overarching concept and then talk about the individual kinds, right? So let's review that real quick as we look over how did she take the notes on this, right? Now, again, we're going to come at this from a different angle. What did Mrs. Haberlight take notes on? And let's look at the page to see that, right? So what is a rigid transformation? A rigid transformation in geometry is a movement of a set of points called the pre-image to a new position called the image in such a way that the image and pre-image have the same size and shape, right? So notice, okay, all the essential details are here. One of the things that's different, as we'll see, is that she just put same size and same shape, right? But it's pretty intense. Just the main paragraph, it's pretty in depth, right? Now also notice lots of underlines, and she uses underlines a little differently. For me, I use underlines to emphasize vocab terms, right? Things that might have definitions of their own. For Mrs. Haberlack, she's using underlines to emphasize kind of what I did by, highlighting, to emphasize the highlights of the definition to make it really easy to read at a glance. If I read only the underlined parts, rigid transformation, movement of a set of points, pre-image to a new position, image, pre-image, image, same size, same shape. See how if I read only the underlines, it basically is the definition still, just not as grammatically like normal, right? It's like a caveman's reading it. That's good, right? That means that only the underlines are really necessary to get a good sense of what's going on. It provides emphasis. It says these are the important parts of the definition. All these other words are just there to connect them, right? So let's check out how that compares to the original page. On the original page, we can see here, right? Basically the same idea, but notice this first part right here, reflections, translations, and rotations are called rigid transformations. That's what we're going to end our definition with. She used the examples for that, as we'll talk about in a second. Instead of focusing on that, she jumps straight to the definition of a rigid transformation. And it's almost exactly the same as what's on the page, right? Just really copying it down. Again, notice she did not copy down the part with congruent figures. My personal style is I would have just said in such a way that the pre-image and image are congruent figures, right? Assuming that I know what congruency is. I can check my notes for that. But Mrs. Haberlight does it the opposite way. Why would I want to remember another vocab term inside this vocab term if I don't have to, right? If I learn that same size and same shape means congruent, awesome, but I don't need to know that for the definition. Different styles, right? Notice as well, she didn't take notes on any of this part, right? None of this paragraph got to notes taken on. That's not the important part. That's building on it, right? But the important part of what is a rigid transformation is only in that first paragraph, so no need to take notes on that second part. You can still take notes on it if you want to, if you feel like you're going to remember that, but she doesn't worry about that so much, right? Because again, it's kind of obvious when you really build it down. So let's talk about that like I said we would, right? When I'm talking about betweenness, if I said point C is between points A and points B, right? All that means is when I build a line, this part plus this part equals this part, right? Now, that's pretty simple to note that when I do things like rotate this or translate it or reflect it, C will always stay in the middle. And you can experiment with that yourself to discern that. But that's really all they're saying, is that if I have these two pieces, no matter how I rotate it or reflect it or translate it, right, they will still stay two pieces stuck together like that. All right. Let's check out again those other three definitions pretty quickly to see what those look like on her page and how they compare to what they look like on AgileMind. With reflection, we can see that she has taken notes on a reflection is a transformation creating a mirror image, right, of a figure on the opposite side of a line, again, highlighting what she's underlined, right? Each point in the reflected image is the same distance from the line as the corresponding point on the original figure, right? Good to know. So again, also taking notes on it's sometimes called a flip, right? We got the picture listed right here to help us remember, right? But for the most part, looks pretty in line with what we talked about in class. Now let's compare that to the AgileMind and you will note some differences. All right, so on AgileMind, playing this animation and watching as the definition pops up, I can already see, well, they haven't talked about mirror image yet. They're talking about folding, right? And likewise, no definition for this one, right? It's all up here. So what Mrs. Haberlack has taken notes on isn't what's on AgileMind, it's what we actually talked about in class, or how Mrs. Haberlack would interpret this definition or might remember it from middle school that makes more sense to her. That's okay. If you wanted to take notes on the folding piece of paper over because that's easier for you to do in person, go for it, right? But Mrs. Haberlack was taking notes on what we said in class because it clicked better for her. I think one of the reasons it clicked better was because it really emphasizes something we said in class, which was in the mirror, the object is the same distance away inside the mirror, like into the mirror, as it is away from the mirror, right? Which is important to remember. Okay, now let's look at the second part. There's another page with the other two definitions. So right here we can see what is a translation? It's a transformation that moves the original shape, right? Notice not a lot of underlines here. Transformation that moves the original shape in a certain direction, sometimes called a slide. So if I had to add underlines, where would I put it? Well, again, think about I would underline the parts that make the definition work. Translation moves the original shape, certain distance, certain direction. That's it, right? And I would say a slide. That's what I would underline out of that definition to really emphasize the important bits, right? Notice, does that look a lot like what was on AgileMind? We'll find out. Now, what about a rotation? A rotation is a transformation that turns the shape around a point a certain number of degrees in a certain direction, sometimes called a turn. Again, underline the important bits, right? That if I read rotation turns the shape around a point, certain number of degrees, specific direction, a turn, you get the idea, right? Now, also notice we have a label here for center of rotation, right? So another little bit labeled there. And here we have that two slides are sometimes easier to see how each point has slid vertically and then how each point has slid horizontally, right? Instead of seeing it as a single diagonal slide. And we can see that in the picture she has drawn, where we have one version that has an arrow going down, an arrow going to the right, and then the other has only the three arrows, just going diagonally. Let's compare this to AgileMind and see what we added, what we changed to make it easier for ourselves. So on AgileMind, translation is a slide or shift of the shape a certain distance in a certain direction. So it looks a lot like what we took notes on. Mrs. Haberlack had added another bit about the two slides being easier than one, right? That's something that she had discovered herself, maybe when working with it later on a future lesson, or maybe when talking about translations in more specific detail in another lesson, right? So Mrs. Haberlack has revisited her notes and interacted with them, adding in a bit that makes more sense for her, an important thing to remember for her. That's why we call them interactive notebooks. We don't need to just put down what's on here. When we revisit these topics, which we will in future lessons, we go back to the original definition and translation to add those kinds of details. So that's a sneak preview of the kind of detail we will learn together. Now for rotation, we're going to see something similar. When we're talking about rotation here, we have the construction, patty paper, things like that, right? So I turn it after building my little axis rotation. They put the pencil in the center here, the origin, and they turn it around that point. You'll notice it's a turn of the shape around a point a certain number of degrees. So again, we have the same definition really, certain number of degrees, turn of the shape around a point, right? But they didn't name a point, right? They didn't call it the center of rotation like Mrs. Haberlack did. That was something she learned in another lesson and came back to this one to emphasize that, right? Being able to interact with the notebook to build upon the definitions to make them make more sense for her. Okay, and that's the notes for today. Just three things, three of them that we've actually seen before, hopefully, taking in some extra details, but we got to see a lot of Mrs. Haberlack's style. The underlining of keywords in order to make it pop in the definition for future reference, unlike me, who tends to underline just vocab words, right? And then the revisiting of prior definitions and materials to build upon them with things that we'll talk about in the future during videos such as these or during future lessons. Okay? And there we go. I hope that makes sense. I hope that helps. And I hope you have a wonderful day.